The screech of metal hangers sliding along a copper pipe rack was the first thing I heard when I pulled into my parents' driveway, and it took me 3 full seconds to understand what I was looking at. My combat boots were lined up on a folding table like garden gnomes. My grandfather's hand-carved woodworking tools were spread across a bedsheet on the wet grass, price tags dangling from the handles. And hanging from a cheap plastic hanger, swaying slightly in the cold October wind, was my dress uniform, 4 rows of ribbons catching the gray morning light. A neon orange sticker taped to the sleeve that read military memorabilia, $15 or best offer. I stood next to my truck with the door still open, engine ticking as it cooled, and I did not move. 23 neighbors, strangers were wandering across my parents' front lawn with paper cups of gas station coffee, picking through crates that held 20 years of my life. My deployment locker sat cracked open near the mailbox, its brass padlock hanging useless from a bent hasp, like someone had gone at it with a crowbar and not cared who noticed. My sister Tabitha was crouched by a cash box, counting crumpled bills with the practiced speed of someone who did this for a living, which, as a real estate broker who hadn't closed a sale in 4 months, she sort of did. She'd set up a card table with a hand-lettered sign, Crawford Estate Sale, everything must go, the kind of phrasing you'd use for a dead relative's belongings rather than a living daughter's. My mother Agatha stood a few feet away in her cream cardigan, explaining to a woman fingering my boots that Lydia doesn't need these dusty old things anymore. The government gives her room and board anyway. Her voice carrying the same bright hostess perfect tone she used at church potlucks. As if my entire military career were a storage unit she'd finally gotten around to clearing out. A folding table near the porch held my citations still zipped inside their protective sleeves, a shadow box with a unit coin I'd been awarded after a deployment nobody in my family had ever asked about, and a stack of photographs from a change of command ceremony, all of it priced between 50 cents and $3, the same range as the chipped mugs and mismatched Tupperware lids scattered across the next table over. I walked across the wet grass. Nobody looked up. A man in a flannel jacket was holding my uniform against himself in the mirror, propped against the porch railing, checking the fit like it was a Halloween costume. I reached past him, lifted it off the hanger, and folded it over my arm without a word. He shrugged and moved on to a stack of my textbooks from Command and General Staff College, priced at $2 each. Lydia. My mother's voice had the particular pitch she used when she was embarrassed in front of an audience. Don't scare off the customers. I looked at her. 20 years of active duty, 3 combat zone rotations, a security clearance that required background investigators to interview my 3rd-grade teacher, and my own mother's first instinct was crowd control. This is my uniform, Mom. It's been sitting in that trunk for a decade, she said, already turning back to the woman with the boots. It's not like you wear it to the grocery store. I didn't answer. I carried the uniform to my truck and laid it across the passenger seat, smoothing the fabric flat the way you'd handle something that had been shot at, which, in a manner of speaking, it had. When I turned around, Tabitha was holding up my grandfather's chisel set, the one Silas Crawford had carved for himself out of hickory handles the winter before he died, and calling out a price to a man in a Carhartt jacket. 10 for the set, they're antique, real craftsman stuff. Those aren't for sale, I said. Tabitha didn't even turn around. Everything on the lawn is for sale, lied. That's what a yard sale is. The man in the Carhartt jacket handed her a $10 bill before I could cross the 15 feet between us, and by the time I got there he was already walking to his truck, chisels tucked under his arm. And there was nothing I could do about it. That wouldn't have turned into a scene my mother would have described for the rest of her life. As the day Lydia lost her mind at a garage sale. So I stood there and watched a stranger's taillights disappear down the county road with the last thing my grandfather's hands had ever made. And I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way it does right before you stop feeling a thing and start calculating instead. Comment A if you would have run after that truck and made a scene right there on the lawn. Comment B if you would have stood still, said nothing, and started building your case instead. I'll tell you which one I chose by the end. My grandfather left me 40 acres of oak and hickory forest behind the old farmhouse, the last unbroken stand of hardwood timber in 3 counties, along with a note that said, "Keep the trees standing, as long as you're breathing, Lydia girl." I'd paid the property taxes on that land for 11 straight years, in full, on time, without once mentioning it to anyone at the dinner table. Because that's what you do when the alternative is watching your family lose something that matters. Nobody had ever asked me how I managed it. Nobody had ever asked me much of anything, actually. Which was the whole shape of the problem. And I hadn't fully understood how deep that shape went until I saw my deployment locker sitting cracked open on my parents' lawn with a padlock that hadn't broken itself. I thought, standing there in the wet grass, about the 6 weeks 3 years earlier, when a supply convoy I was overseeing took small arms fire outside a forward logistics hub, and I'd spent 2 nights coordinating an emergency medical resupply route from a bunker with a concussion I hadn't yet reported. Because reporting it would have pulled me off the mission, and there was nobody else positioned to finish it. I'd called home once that month, mostly out of habit, and my mother had spent the entire 11-minute call describing a dispute with Tabitha's wedding florist over ranunculus pricing. I never mentioned the convoy. She never asked what I'd been doing. It hadn't even occurred to me at the time that the omission was strange, because by then silence about my actual life had become the only language we had left in common. I remembered the exact moment the pattern set itself, though it took me most of 2 decades to name it properly. I was 17, sitting at the same kitchen table with a letter of acceptance into the Army's Medical Logistics Officer program, an achievement that had required a physical, a battery of aptitude exams, and an interview panel 3 officers deep. My mother had read the letter once, set it down next to Tabitha's cheerleading regionals schedule, and asked only whether I'd still be home for Tabitha's homecoming game. I said yes. Nobody asked me a second question about the program, not that night, not in the 18 years that followed it. And by the time I shipped out to my first duty station at 20, I had already learned not to expect one. For 20 years, my family had operated on a single working theory about my life: that I filed paperwork somewhere warm, cashed a government check twice a month, and existed mostly as a source of low-interest loans and unpaid property tax coverage. My actual title: Chief of Intelligence and Logistics Security for the Army's Combat Medical Command, had never once come up at a holiday dinner, because nobody had ever asked what it meant. My mother introduced me at church as our daughter in the service, the same phrase she'd have used for a daughter who mopped floors at the commissary. My father, Leland, a retired county land surveyor, who'd spent 40 years measuring other people's property lines and none of his own courage, had learned early that agreeing with Agatha was easier than being right, and he'd applied that principle to every argument in the house since 1994. Tabitha was the one who got asked questions. Tabitha, at 29, sold houses that mostly stayed on the market past their listing date, drove a leased SUV 2 payments behind, and had married Sheldon Lockhart 18 months ago in a ceremony that cost more than my last 3 years of base housing allowance combined. Sheldon ran a medical equipment and construction outfit called Lockhart Development, and every time his name came up at dinner, my mother's voice took on the reverent hush she used for lottery winners and megachurch pastors. I gathered the rest of what I could carry: a stack of citations still in their frames, my boots, a folder of unit photos someone had priced at 50 cents each, and loaded them into my truck bed under a tarp, working in silence while the yard sale wound down around me like nothing unusual was happening. Because to everyone else, nothing unusual was. By the time I dragged my deployment locker back toward the old well house where I used to keep my things, the sun had burned off most of the fog, and the lawn was down to a handful of stragglers picking through what was left. The locker's hasps was bent at an angle that told exactly how it had been opened, fast, with a pry bar, by someone who didn't care about damage because they weren't planning on giving the locker back intact anyway. I set it down on the well house floor and lifted the lid. And that's when I saw the manila envelope wedged at the bottom, half torn, papers spilling out like something had gone through it in a hurry, and not bothered to put things back. I sat down on the cold concrete and started reading, and by the 3rd page my hands had gone as still as the rest of me. The document on top was a commercial loan agreement from a bank 3 counties over, First Ashford Trust, dated the previous February. The borrower listed was Lockhart Development, LLC. The collateral listed was 40 acres of timberland in Ashwood County. Legal description matching my grandfather's land parcel by parcel, right down to the creek boundary. The loan amount was $450,000. And stapled to the back, faded but legible, was a photocopy of a military power of attorney bearing my signature, dated the summer I turned 18. The one I'd signed in a recruiting office parking lot, so my parents could handle basic mail and paperwork while I was at my first duty station in Germany and couldn't be reached by phone half the time. I hadn't thought about that piece of paper in 17 years. I hadn't revoked it because nobody revokes a document they've forgotten exists. Sheldon Lockhart, apparently, had remembered it just fine. Underneath the loan agreement was a second document, a disbursement schedule, showing where the $450,000 had actually gone, not toward any timber operation, but in staggered transfers to a payroll account, a vehicle lease company, and a $38,600 payment to a caterer that I recognized, with a slow, sinking clarity, as the same caterer who'd handled Tabitha and Sheldon's wedding 18 months earlier. He hadn't borrowed against my grandfather's forest to build anything. He'd borrowed against it to cover debts he'd already accumulated, living a life his actual business couldn't support. And he'd done it using a signature I'd given at 18 years old to make sure my mail got forwarded correctly, while I was half a world away learning how to keep other people's supply chains from collapsing. I read the loan file twice more, cross-referencing the notarization stamp against a business card I found clipped to the back. A notary public whose office address turned out, when I checked it later that week, to be the same strip mall as Lockhart Development's headquarters. I photographed every page with my phone before the light in the well house got too dim to read by. And then I sat there a while longer, listening to the last of the yard sale customers pulling out of the driveway, and I let myself feel exactly one thing before I put it away. The particular, bottomless quiet of understanding that the family currently mocking you for your absence has been quietly spending your name behind your back the entire time. By breakfast the next morning, I had already decided not to say anything about the forest yet. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and the cinnamon candle my mother kept lit year-round on the windowsill. And Tabitha was holding court at the table with a new handbag. Propped on the seat beside her like a dinner guest, cream leather with gold hardware, a designer name on the clasp that I recognized because Tabitha had mentioned it approximately 400 times since I'd walked in the door 2 days earlier. "Sheldon got it for our anniversary," she said, running her thumb along the strap. 6 months early. He says once the federal contract closes, we're doing Italy for the real anniversary. "What federal contract?" I asked, pouring coffee I didn't especially want just to have something to do with my hands. "Timber supply for veteran housing projects," my mother said, beaming like she'd landed the contract herself. Multi-million-dollar. Sheldon's firm was practically hand-picked. I set the loan agreement on the table, face up next to the sugar bowl. Tabitha glanced at it, then at me, then back at her coffee, unbothered, like I'd set down a grocery receipt. "That's the collateral filing on Grandpa's forest," I said. $450,000, secured against land that's in my name. There's a power of attorney attached that I signed at 18. I never authorized this loan. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there. My mother's smile thinned but didn't disappear, the way it does on people who have decided in advance that whatever comes next is a misunderstanding to be managed, rather than a fact to be addressed. Leland set his fork down slowly, glanced at the loan agreement, then at me, then at Agatha. And I watched him do the same calculation he'd been doing for 40 years, weigh the cost of saying something true against the cost of another silent breakfast, and lose, the way he always lost, choosing his coffee cup over his voice. Tabitha let out a short laugh, more air than sound. "Lead, you've spent 20 years counting bandages in a supply closet somewhere. Sheldon operates in a different world. It's paperwork. It's fine. Just sign the final release when he brings it by and stop treating everything like a security briefing." "I'd like to talk to Sheldon directly," I said. "He's at the site all week," Tabitha said. "Look, just sign the asset waiver when it comes, okay? It clears up the title so the closing can go through clean. It's not a big deal." I looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at me with the mild, faintly bored expression of someone who genuinely believed the conversation was already over. My mother reached across the table and patted Tabitha's hand, the same gesture she used to comfort Tabitha when a listing fell through, the exact gesture she had never once used on me. I'll look into it, I said, and I meant it in a way none of them understood yet. I didn't look into it from the kitchen table. I looked into it from the cab of my truck, parked at the far end of my parents' gravel driveway, with the engine running for heat, logged into the Combat Medical Command's secure logistics portal on a hardened laptop that never left my direct custody. My actual job, the one nobody at that table had ever asked about, gave me access to financial fraud detection tools built for tracking stolen medical equipment and forged federal contracts across 3 time zones. Sheldon Lockhart's company was, from a systems standpoint, a remarkably easy target. Lockhart Development had bid on a federal timber and lumber supply contract for a veteran transitional housing project worth $2.1 million. And the bid package included land-use certifications for timberland that, according to the county assessor's own records I pulled at 11:52 that night, Sheldon didn't own, hadn't leased, and had no documented right to harvest, except for the 40 acres now listed as loan collateral under a power of attorney I'd signed at 18 and never revoked. His actual business financials, buried under 3 shell entities and a line of credit he was 6 weeks behind on, showed a company that was not merely struggling but functionally insolvent. The federal bid, if it went through, was the only thing standing between Lockhart Development and a bankruptcy filing that would have taken my sister's new handbag, her leased SUV, and very possibly her marriage down with it. He'd used my land because he believed, correctly for 17 years, that nobody in his orbit would ever check the paperwork closely enough to notice. He hadn't counted on the one person in the family whose entire job was noticing. Digging further, I found the trail even messier than the loan file alone suggested. Lockhart Development had submitted the same 40-acre parcel as collateral on 2 separate smaller loans the previous spring, both under different shell entities, both approved by lenders who never cross-referenced against each other. Sheldon wasn't just committing one fraud against me. He was running the same play on a rotating cast of lenders, each one believing they held first position on land that, in reality, was pledged 3 times over to cover a company hemorrhaging money faster than any single loan could patch. It was, in its own way, an almost impressive piece of financial choreography, provided you didn't much care who eventually got hurt when the music inevitably, predictably, finally stopped playing altogether. Somewhere around midnight, I called a former deployment partner named Ines Alvarado, a JAG paralegal I'd worked alongside during a supply fraud investigation in my second overseas rotation, mostly because I needed someone to tell me whether what I was looking at held up as cleanly as I thought it did. We'd spent 4 months together in a converted shipping container, tracking a stolen fuel shipment across 3 provinces, and if there was one person left in my life I trusted to tell me the truth, instead of the comfortable version of it, it was her. Thing is listen to the whole thing without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I trusted her. And when I finished, she was quiet for a second before she said, "Lydia, this isn't a family disagreement. This is a felony wearing a family disagreement as a costume. Document everything, and don't sign a single piece of paper they hand you, no matter how it's worded." It was the first time in 2 weeks that anyone had said out loud what I already knew, and hearing it from someone outside the house made it feel less like paranoia and more like fact. I worked until nearly 2 in the morning, and by the time I closed the laptop, I had a folder of evidence organized the way I organized everything, chronologically, cross-referenced, footnoted, and a plan that didn't involve a single raised voice. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office and filed an emergency environmental protection caveat on the 40 acres, citing the property's status as a documented old-growth hardwood stand, which triggered an automatic freeze on any further liens or transfers pending review. The clerk who processed it, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, asked me twice if I was certain I wanted to file it as an emergency measure rather than a standard request, since the emergency filing fee ran $340 instead of the usual $85. I paid the $340 without hesitation. From there, I drove 11 miles to the regional office of First Ashford Trust and requested in person a certified copy of every document on file bearing my signature or my power of attorney designation, citing my rights as the named principal. The loan officer who pulled the file, a woman named Carol Whitfield, went visibly pale about halfway through reading the stack herself, and admitted, In a lowered voice I don't think she was supposed to use with a customer. That the file had raised questions internally when it was first processed, but had gone through anyway because Sheldon's paperwork looked complete. She printed the certified copies without asking Mai to explain further, slid them across the counter along with a business card for the bank's internal fraud division, and said quietly, "For what it's worth, Colonel, I hope this gets sorted out in your favor." I asked her to flag the account for fraud review and left a written statement on the spot. I called my unit's legal office that same afternoon and initiated formal revocation of the 20-year-old power of attorney, effective immediately, with certified notice sent to every institution that had it on file. And I placed a hold on the 2 joint accounts my parents still kept me listed on from a decade ago, the ones they occasionally used to cover overdrafts they didn't think I noticed. I did all of it by 4 that afternoon. I didn't mention a word of it to anyone. And that evening I ate my father's beef stew at the small kitchen table and complimented the cornbread, because there was no reason yet for the walls I just built to be visible from the inside. Sheldon himself finally showed up at the farmhouse Monday evening, dropping off a bottle of wine for my mother and a folder of glossy site renderings he wanted Tabitha to look over before the hearing. He found me on the porch, and for a moment he seemed genuinely pleased to see me, the way people are pleased to see someone they've successfully stopped thinking about as a variable. "Lydia, good. You're still around." Tabitha mentioned the paperwork mix-up. "I'll get my assistant to sort out whatever got flagged. Don't worry yourself over it." He said it with the easy, unhurried warmth of a man who had never once had to work to be believed. And I understood, watching him lean against the porch rail like he owned the boards under his shoes. Exactly how he'd gotten this far without anyone in my family stopping to ask a hard question. "There's no mix-up, Sheldon," I said. "There's a power of attorney you used without my consent, a notary whose license was suspended before she stamped your paperwork, and a loan you've already spent on things that have nothing to do with timber." For just a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his eyes, not fear exactly. More like the flicker of a man doing rapid math on how much I actually knew. Then the smile came back, smoother than before. "You've always taken things a little too literally," he said. "It's a technicality. Once the contract closes, everyone gets paid, everyone's happy. I'd hate for you to make things difficult for your own sisters over paperwork." He picked up the wine bottle he'd set down and headed back to his car without waiting for a response, confident, I could tell, that he'd said whatever needed saying to make the problem disappear. I watched his taillights pull out of the driveway and thought, not without some grim satisfaction, that he had absolutely no idea he'd just handed me a recorded admission on my own front porch, because I'd learned a long time ago never to have a conversation like that one without my phone already running. The bank's automated rejection notice hit my father's phone on Tuesday morning at 9:14, a construction credit line he'd co-signed for Sheldon 8 months earlier, without fully understanding what he was signing. And by the sound of Agatha's voice carrying through the farmhouse walls, 20 minutes later, the freeze had been noticed. They cornered me on the back porch that afternoon, my mother in front, Tabitha a step behind with her arms crossed over the designer handbag like it needed protecting from me specifically. "You froze the accounts," Agatha said. "It wasn't a question. I revoked a power of attorney that was being used without my knowledge to mortgage my grandfather's forest," I said. "That's what I did. Sheldon's whole contract depends on that closing going through this week," Tabitha said, her voice climbing. "Do you understand what you're doing to us?" "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said, and I meant that too, more than she knew. "Sign the rectification deed," my mother said, holding out a folded document I recognized instantly as a rewritten version of the asset waiver from breakfast, dressed up with new language and a notary stamp dated that morning. "Sign it and this all goes away. We can fix this quietly like a family." "No," I said. The slap came fast enough that I felt it before I fully registered my mother's hand, moving, a sharp crack across my left cheek that echoed off the porch railing and startled a pair of crows off the fence line. "You selfish parasite," Agatha said, her voice breaking into something ugly and unfamiliar. 20 years we have given you everything, and this is how you repay your sister? You are ruining her life." I stood there with my cheek burning, and I did not raise my hand, and I did not raise my voice. "I paid the taxes on that forest for 11 years, Mother," I said. Every one of them on time, without a single thank you, because that's what Grandpa asked me to do and I do what I say I'll do. Today, the lease on my silence expires. Nobody said anything after that. My father stood in the kitchen doorway the entire time and said nothing at all, which by then had stopped surprising me. I walked off the porch and down toward the tree line before either of them could say anything else, because my hands had started to shake, and I did not want my mother to see that as anything other than what it actually was, which was 20 years of accumulated silence finally finding an exit. The path to the forest ran past the old well house and down a slope thick fallen hickory leaves. And I stopped where the tree canopy opened up over the creek my grandfather used to fish in every October. Back when I was young enough to sit on his shoulders and old enough to remember every word he said about the land. He'd walked me through these same acres the autumn I turned 12, pointing out which oaks were older than the county courthouse, explaining that a forest like this one didn't belong to a person so much as a person belonged to it for a while, and that the job was to leave it better tended than you found it. He'd left the land to me instead of to my mother because, he told me once in the hospital the week before he died, I was the only one in the family who'd ever asked him a real question about it that wasn't about the resale value. I was 14 years old when he said that, and I hadn't understood yet how much of the rest of my life it would end up describing. I'd made my first tax payment on the parcel at 24, forwarding a cashier's check for $2, 140.60 from an internet cafe outside a forward operating base because the county didn't accept international wire transfers, and I wasn't willing to let the land lapse into a lien sale over a technicality. I'd made a payment every year since, the number climbing slowly with reassessments. 2, 478. 15 then 2, 9, 10. 40 then, this past spring, 3, 9, 18. 47, paid in full 9 days before the deadline from a checking account nobody at that breakfast table had ever asked to see the balance of. Not once in 11 years had my mother, my father, or my sister asked how the taxes got paid, or noticed that the county never sent a delinquency notice, or wondered why a forest that generated no income somehow kept surviving intact year after year. They hadn't wondered, because wondering about me had simply never occurred to them as a category of thought worth having. Standing at the creek with my cheek still faintly warm from the slap, I understood something I hadn't let myself say out loud yet, even to myself. I wasn't protecting the forest because I loved trees more than I loved my family. I was protecting it because it was the one thing in 20 years that had never once made me feel invisible. And I was not going to let Sheldon Lockhart's failing construction company burn it down to cover a debt he was too proud to admit he couldn't pay. I drove back to base that night instead of staying in the guest room because I needed distance and because the work waiting for me at Fort Halloway didn't stop, just because my family had decided to declare war on a Tuesday afternoon. The drive gave me 40 minutes alone with the radio off, just the hum of the highway and the dull ache still radiating from my cheek. And somewhere around the county line, I stopped replaying the slap itself and started replaying everything that had led up to it: the yard sale, the locker, the breakfast table. 20 years of assumptions stacked one on top of another until they'd calcified into something that looked, from the inside of that family, almost like normal life. I called my direct supervisor, a colonel named Marguerite Voss, from the parking lot before I even went inside, my cheek still faintly tender under my palm, and gave her the short version. A civilian contractor was using forged military land use certifications and a fraudulent power of attorney to secure a federal timber contract. And the paper trail led straight back to my own family's front door. Voss was quiet on the line for a moment, the particular pause I recognized from 3 years of briefing her on things that mattered. "Say that again," she said, slowly, "and tell me the contractor's name." I told her everything: the loan, the suspended notary, the forged land use certifications, the federal timber bid built on top of all of it. And when I finished, she exhaled, long and even, the way she did before she made a decision she already knew was correct but hadn't yet said out loud. "Crawford, I need every document you photographed sent to my secure inbox by 0800 tomorrow, unredacted, with a full chain of custody memo. This isn't a family matter anymore. The second a federal defense housing contract is involved, this belongs to people well above my pay grade, and once I forward it, I lose the ability to keep it quiet even if either of us wanted to, which I don't think either of us does. Understood, I said. For what it's worth, Voss added before she hung up. I've read your file more than once, Major. This is exactly the kind of thing you were built to catch. I'm sorry it happened to be your own family standing in front of it. That was the entire response I'd trained 20 years to expect from the people who actually knew how to do their jobs, as opposed to the people who'd raised me plain, competent, and free of the theatrics I'd spent a lifetime absorbing at that kitchen table. What Voss didn't say, but what I already knew from 3 years working under her, was that a case like this one, federal contract fraud layered on top of forged military documents, didn't stay contained to a colonel's desk for long. Forged land use certifications, tied to a defense housing contract, meant Inspector General involvement. Inspector General involvement meant the file would eventually cross a general officer's desk, because that's how the chain worked when a contractor tried to defraud the government using stolen military credentials. I didn't request that outcome. I simply reported what I'd found, the way regulations required, and let the machine I'd spent 2 decades helping build do what it was built to do. I hadn't spoken to General Alistair Cooper directly in 6 years, not since he'd pinned a commendation on my chest in a ceremony my family hadn't attended, because Tabitha had a showing that weekend. Cooper ran logistics and intelligence oversight for a piece of the federal command structure, large enough that most people who worked under him never once heard his actual voice, let alone took a call from him. He was the kind of officer who remembered names, remembered case files, and remembered, apparently, the quiet major who'd spent 3 deployments keeping medical supply chains running clean while everyone else took the credit for the parts that were easy to see. I didn't know, that week, that my report had already reached his desk. I only knew that I'd done what the job required, and that whatever happened next was out of my hands in the particular way that only genuinely doing things by the book can make something feel. The County Planning Commission hearing on Sheldon's timber bid was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10. In the morning, a public session at the Ashwood County Courthouse meant to finalize zoning approval in front of the investors backing the veteran housing development. Tabitha had been talking about it for a week like it was a wedding. The venue, the presentation boards, Sheldon had commissioned, the caterer bringing coffee and pastries for the commissioners. I found out the exact time from a flyer Tabitha left on the kitchen counter, glossy and professionally printed, Sheldon's headshot in the corner looking like a man who had never once doubted himself. I decided to go, not to speak, not to interrupt. I put on a plain navy dress instead of anything that would draw attention. And I sat in the back row near the exit doors, close enough to see everything, and far enough that none of the local photographers documenting the county's big development win would think to point a lens my way. The morning of the hearing, I stopped by the county clerk's office before it opened to confirm something I'd suspected since I first read the loan file in the well house. The notary who'd stamped my power of attorney copy for First Ashford Trust had her license suspended 11 months earlier for an unrelated filing violation, which meant every document she'd notarized since then, including Sheldon's, was legally void the moment anyone bothered to check. I photographed the suspension order, added it to the folder I'd been building for 2 weeks, and drove to the courthouse with the kind of calm that used to unsettle new soldiers under my command before they learned. It meant I already knew how the situation was going to end. The Ashwood County Courthouse Annex had been dressed up for the occasion, a projector screen at the front, folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a table near the podium set with coffee urns and a tray of pastries nobody had touched yet. I counted maybe 60 people in the gallery by the time the commissioners took their seats at 9:58, local business owners, a few reporters from the regional paper, and a cluster of men in good suits I recognized from Tabitha's description as the investors backing the veteran housing development. Sheldon stood near the presentation board in a charcoal suit that looked expensive even from the back row, running through his notes with the loose, easy confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility of losing. Tabitha sat in the second row beside my mother. Both of them turned slightly to watch the investors rather than the commissioners, the way you watch an audience you're performing for rather than one you're accountable to. My father sat a row behind them, alone, his hands folded in his lap in the particular stillness of a man who had spent his whole life hoping that not participating counted as not being responsible. 3 items on the agenda preceded Sheldon's: a fence height variance, a request to rezone a strip of commercial frontage near the highway exit, and a dispute over a shared driveway easement between 2 families who'd apparently been feuding since before I was born. I sat through all of it, watching the clock above the commissioner's bench tick toward the item everyone in the room was actually there for, and I used the wait to go through my folder one final time, checking the notary suspension order against the loan filing date, the caveat registration against the county assessor's parcel records, the frozen account confirmations against the dates on Sheldon's own funding timeline. Every piece fit exactly where I'd left it. A woman 2 rows ahead of me leaned over to her husband at one point and murmured something about how exciting it was that a local company had landed a federal contract. And I caught myself almost laughing at how completely the county had already absorbed Sheldon's version of events. How thoroughly a confident man in a good suit could rewrite a story simply by telling it first and telling it loudest. It reminded me, sitting there, of my own family's version of my life, 20 years of a story told confidently by people who'd never once checked whether it was true. By the time Hobbs cleared his throat and shuffled his papers toward item 4, my hands had stopped shaking entirely, replaced by the particular focused calm I used to feel in the hour before a convoy departure, when every variable that could be controlled already had been. The lead commissioner, a heavyset man named Reginald Hobbs, who I'd later learn had known my grandfather personally, called the session to order at 10:03 and moved through the routine business faster than I expected, clearly eager to get to the marquee item on the agenda. Item 4, Hobbs said, adjusting his glasses. Lockhart Development, Federal Veteran Housing Timber Supply Proposal. Mr. Lockhart, the floor is yours. Sheldon stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the podium with the unhurried stride of a man who had rehearsed this walk in a mirror. Thank you, Commissioner Hobbs, members of the board, he said, his voice smooth and practiced, carrying easily across the room. Ashwood County is about to become home to one of the most significant veteran housing developments in the state. And I'm proud that Lockhart Development has been selected as the primary timber supplier. He clicked to the first slide, a rendering of neat rows of houses framed by tall trees. And the investors in the front row leaned forward with the particular attentiveness of men watching a return on investment take visual shape. I sat perfectly still in the back row, the folder in my lap, and I let him talk. Our land use certifications are fully in order, Sheldon continued, gesturing toward the screen as a new slide appeared, dense with numbers I already knew didn't add up. 40 acres of prime, harvest-ready hardwood, secured and cleared for supply beginning next quarter, at a price point 20% below any competing bid in the region. He clicked forward again to a slide showing a projected timeline: first delivery in 11 weeks, full contract fulfillment within 14 months. A total contract value of $2,140,000 zalins that made 2 of the investors in the front row exchange a satisfied glance. We're not just building houses for veterans, Sheldon said, letting the line land with the practiced weight of a man who'd rehearsed for the exact pause that followed it. We're building on land with real history, real roots, land that's been in a single family for generations. That kind of story matters to people. I sat very still in the back row at that particular line, because he was described my grandfather's forest as a marketing asset. In the same breath, he was defrauding the granddaughter who actually owned it. And something about the sheer nerve of it very nearly pulled me out of my chair 3 minutes earlier than it eventually did. Reginald Hobbs was nodding along, tapping his pen against the table in the satisfied rhythm of a man watching a problem solve itself. And I understood, sitting there in the back row with a folder full of documents that told a completely different story, that if I didn't do something in the next several minutes, this fraud was going to close, funded, and finalized, in front of 60 witnesses who would spend the next year telling everyone in the county what a visionary Sheldon Lockhart was. I stood up from my chair. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say yet, only that silence had done its job for 2 weeks and its usefulness had run out. But before I could take a single step toward the aisle, the telephone at the commissioner's bench began to ring. Not the ordinary courthouse line, but a secure landline mounted separately at the end of the table. One I recognized instantly because I'd used identical hardware 100 times myself, reserved exclusively for priority federal and state communications. Old. Reginald Hobbs stopped mid-sentence. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something is happening that nobody in the audience has a script for. Hobbs picked up the receiver, listened for perhaps 4 seconds, and I watched color drain out of his face like someone had opened a valve. He stood up slowly, the receiver still in his hand, and stepped toward the small microphone clipped to the podium beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been for the entire 90 minutes prior. "Please excuse the interruption. This is a direct call from the Office of the Joint Chiefs. General Alistair Cooper is on the line, and he is requesting to speak immediately with the senior logistics officer present in this county." Somewhere between minutes 45 and 55 of the video I put out last month, there's a scene almost exactly like this one. A family confident they'd already won, right up until the moment the story turned on them. If you haven't seen it yet, it's sitting in the corner of your screen right now, and I promise it's worth the detour once you finish this one. For now, though, I need you back here in this courtroom with me, because the next 4 minutes are the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. Reginald Hobbs set the receiver down on the table without hanging it up, which struck me later as the single most human thing anyone in that room did all morning. He didn't trust himself to end the call properly. He turned toward the double doors at the back of the annex, and every head in the gallery turned him, including Sheldon's, who was still standing at the podium with his laser pointer raised. Halfway through explaining a supply chain timeline that no longer mattered to anyone in the building, the doors opened, and General Alistair Cooper walked in. I'd seen him in dress uniform exactly twice before, both times at ceremonies, where I was one name among many being read off a program, and even from those distances I remembered the effect he had on a room. In person, at close range in a county courthouse annex that had been decorated with folding chairs and a coffee urn, the effect was closer to a change in air pressure. 4 stars gleamed on each shoulder, his ribbons stacked in rows I recognized from 3 decades of federal service. Most people in that gallery would never have the clearance to fully understand. 2 military police officers flanked him a half step back, and behind them, a pair of investigators in plain suits carried slim black cases that I recognized from 3 years of working adjacent to federal fraud cases as evidence transport kits. The gallery went silent in a way I had never personally witnessed 60 civilians manage before. My mother rose halfway out of her seat, her rehearsed smile already forming, the same smile she used on prospective real estate clients and church committee chairs. And she took 2 steps toward the aisle like she intended to greet him personally and smooth over whatever confusion had produced this interruption. My father stayed frozen in his chair, his hands gripping his knees. General Cooper walked past both of them without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement, the way you walk past furniture. He crossed the entire length of the gallery, his boots striking the tile floor in a rhythm too, even to be anything but deliberate, and he stopped directly in front of the back row, in front of me, and snapped a crisp, formal salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Crawford," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the annex without him raising it at all. "Your promotion order came through the Pentagon at 0800 this morning, signed off through the National Security Council review. I flew in from Fort Halloway the moment I confirmed you were sitting in this room." I stood and returned the salute, my hands steady despite everything happening inside my chest, and behind me I heard 60 people inhale at almost exactly the same moment. Hallie, 20 years of classified logistic and intelligence work in the Combat Medical Command. Cooper continued, turning slightly so his voice reached the commissioner's bench as clearly as it reached the back row. Kept 3 overseas medical supply corridors running clean under conditions most people in this room could not begin to imagine, and personally identified and dismantled 2 separate procurement fraud schemes that would otherwise have compromised military hospital equipment supply chains. Your service record is not administrative, Colonel. It is the reason a substantial number of soldiers in this country came home alive. I heard my mother make a small sound behind me, something between a gasp and a word that never fully formed. Tabitha had gone completely white, one hand still resting on the designer handbag like it might steady her. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman I didn't recognize whispered, loudly enough to carry, "That's the daughter from the yard sale." And I understood in that moment that whatever freak story the county had been telling itself about the Crawford family for the last 2 weeks was about to be rewritten in real time, in front of everyone who'd ever repeated it. "You told them I filed paperwork," I said quietly. Not really to Cooper, not really to anyone, just out loud because 20 years of not saying it had finally caught up to the moment where saying it mattered. Cooper's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Then they were operating on very old information, Colonel, and they're about to receive an update. He turned from me toward the front of the room, toward Sheldon, who was still standing at the podium with the laser pointer now hanging loose at his side, his charcoal suit suddenly looking less like confidence and more like a costume 2 sizes too tight. The two investigators stepped forward, unlatching their cases. "Mr. Lockhart," Cooper said, his voice dropping into something colder, flatter, the voice I imagined he used in rooms with far higher stakes than a county planning commission. "You submitted a federal contract bid supported by land use certifications for property you do not own, secured through a power of attorney that was legally revoked 3 weeks ago, and a notarization performed by an individual whose license was suspended 11 months prior. That is not a paperwork error. That is contract fraud against the United States government, layered on top of forgery and identity theft against a serving military officer." One of the investigators produced a folder and stepped up beside Cooper. "That, Sheldon Lockhart," he said, reading from a printed sheet with the flat, practiced cadence of someone who'd done this many times before. "You're being detained pending formal charges of federal procurement fraud, forgery of legal instruments, and financial identity theft. Lockhart Development's federal bid is void as of this moment, and a hold has been placed on all associated company accounts, pending the outcome of the investigation." The second investigator produced a set of handcuffs, not yet applying them, simply holding them visibly enough that the message reached the entire gallery without a word needing to be said. Sheldon's hands, still gripping the laser pointer, had gone white, knuckled around the small plastic device. And for a moment, he looked at the exits like a man calculating odds he already knew weren't in his favor. The projector screen behind the podium, still connected to Sheldon's laptop, flickered without anyone touching it. One of the investigators had already linked into the system. And the rendering of neat houses framed by tall trees vanished, replaced by a scanned image of the suspended notary's disciplinary order, followed by the loan agreement with my forged signature line highlighted in red, followed by a bankruptcy filing risk assessment dated 2 weeks earlier, showing Lockhart Development's real financial position. $41,000 in the bank against $960,000 in outstanding obligations. The investors in the front row, the men who'd leaned forward so eagerly 20 minutes earlier, were now leaning back in their chairs with the particular stillness of men calculating exactly how much of their own money they'd nearly lost. One of the investors in the front row, an older man in a gray suit who I later learned represented the regional fund backing the housing development, stood up and addressed the commissioners directly, his voice tight with the particular anger of a man realizing how close he'd come to writing a very large check. "We conducted 3 rounds of due diligence on this bid," he said. "Land certifications, financial statements, references. All of it came back clean." He turned toward Sheldon, who was being guided gently by the elbow toward the side door. "How does a company this insolvent pass 3 rounds of due diligence?" "Because the paperwork was forged well enough to survive a surface review," one of the federal investigators answered, closing his case with a quiet snap. "That's the entire function of forgery, sir. It's designed to pass exactly the kind of check you're describing. It only fails against people who know what the real documents are supposed to look like." He didn't look at me when he said, "But," Colonel Voss's earlier words came back to me anyway. "This is exactly the kind of thing you were built to catch." And I understood, watching the investor sit back down, pale and shaken, that the fraud hadn't just threatened my family's forest. It had threatened a $2 million federal housing project meant to shelter actual veterans, dressed up in a rendering of neat houses under tall trees that had never been anything but a lie projected onto a screen. Sheldon didn't say anything. He looked For the first time since I'd met him 18 months ago, like a man who had run out of rooms to talk his way out of. The military police officers escorted Sheldon out through a side door reserved for jury access, past folding chairs and untouched pastries, past investors already pulling out their phones, past Tabitha, who stood up so fast. Her chair scraped backward against the tile and called his name once, sharply, before catching herself when 60 pairs of eyes turned toward her instead. Fine. Reginald Hobbs adjourned the hearing without finishing the agenda, his voice cracking slightly on the word adst. Adjourned, and the room dissolved into the low, urgent murmur of people who had just watched something happen that they would be describing at dinner tables across the county for the next several months. Reginald Hobbs found me near the exit doors as the room slowly emptied, his glasses slightly askew, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the last 20 minutes. He set down the gavel he was still holding, as if he'd forgotten it was in his hand until that moment. "Colonel," he said, testing the rank carefully, like he wanted to make sure he had it right this time. I knew Silas Crawford for 30 years. Sat on the fair committee with him. He used to talk about a granddaughter who'd joined the army and never once talked about his own worry over it. He shook his head slowly. I don't think he'd have been surprised by any of this. I think he'd have been furious it took this long for the rest of us to notice. He knew, I said. He was the only one who ever asked. Hobbs nodded, shook my hand, and excused himself to deal with the small crowd of reporters now gathering near the annex doors. Already asking questions about the federal contract, about Lockhart development, about the general who'd walked into a county planning hearing with military police in tow. I stepped past them without answering. Because none of it was mine to explain, not anymore. General Cooper stayed a few minutes longer, speaking quietly to the lead investigator, confirming details I couldn't fully hear from where I stood. And then he turned back to me and lowered his voice to something almost gentle, which felt strange coming from a man who'd just dismantled a fraud scheme in front of 60 witnesses without raising his pulse. The transfer to the National Security Council Liaison Office starts in 6 weeks, Colonel, he said. Pentagon staff. It's earned, not offered as a courtesy, and I imagine you already know the difference. He glanced past me, toward where my mother and father stood frozen near the second row, neither of them quite able to close the distance between themselves and the daughter they now understood they had badly misjudged. Take whatever time you need to settle your affairs here. The job will still be waiting. He saluted me a second time and I returned it. And then he was gone, back through the double doors with his investigators, leaving behind a courtroom that smelled like burnt coffee and felt to me unexpectedly quiet. Tabitha found me first in the parking lot, the designer handbag still slung over her shoulder like a habit she hadn't remembered to break. Her mascara had smeared under one eye, and her voice, when she finally spoke, had none of the breakfast table certainty from 2 weeks earlier. Lydia, you have to talk to someone. A lawyer, the investigators, someone. I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know what he was doing with the land. I believe you didn't ask, I said. And I watched that land the way the slap had landed on me, quiet and precise. That's not quite the same thing as not knowing. What's going to happen to me? She asked. And for the first time in 18 months I heard something in her voice that wasn't performance. The house, the accounts, we co-signed things together, Lydia. I could lose everything. I froze what was in my name to protect what was mine, I said. What happens to the rest of it depends on what the federal investigators find when they look at your name on those documents too. I'm not the one who can fix that for you. I never was. She didn't have anything to say to that. She stood in the parking lot with her handbag and her ruined mascara while I walked to my truck. And I let her stand there, because for 20 years I had absorbed every silence in that family so someone else wouldn't have to sit in one, and I had decided, somewhere between the well house and the courthouse, that my turn was over. I drove to a motel off the highway that night, instead of back to the farmhouse, because I didn't trust myself yet to sit across a dinner table from any of them, and because for the first time in 2 weeks, I let myself feel the whole thing at once instead of managing it one procedural step at a time. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and the heater knocked twice before it caught. And I sat on the edge of the mattress, still in the navy dress I'd worn to the hearing, replaying the sound of General Cooper's voice reading off my service record like it belonged to someone I'd only recently met. I called Ines, who picked up on the second ring even though it was nearly 10 at night. It's done, I told her. He's in federal custody. The general showed up himself. How do you feel? Ines asked. And it struck me sitting there that almost nobody in my life had asked me that question in a way that expected an honest answer rather than a polite one. Tired, I said after a moment. 20 years tired. I keep waiting to feel like I won something, and mostly I just feel like I finally stopped losing. I told her about the slap on the porch, about my mother's rehearsed smile dissolving. The second Cooper walked past her like she was furniture, about the strange hollow quiet of watching your own mother realize, in real time, that the daughter she'd spent 2 decades underestimating had been quietly holding the family together the whole time. Enos listened, without trying to fix any of it, which was exactly what I needed. And somewhere around 11 I finally let myself cry, alone, in a motel room with the heater rattling. For the first time since the whole ordeal had started, not out of sadness exactly, but out of the sheer physical release of setting down something I'd been carrying, without realizing how heavy it had gotten. Fathers. My parents caught up to me 3 days later at the farmhouse in the kitchen where the whole thing had started with a folded loan document set down next to the sugar bowl. Agatha had aged 5 years in 72 hours, her cream cardigan replaced with something dark and shapeless. And Leland stood a step behind her the way he always had, except this time his hands weren't folded, they were shaking, just slightly, the way hands shake when a man is finally reckoning with 40 years of choosing comfort over courage. We didn't know what he was capable of, Agatha said, and I watched her reach for the same rehearsed cadence she used at church, the tone meant to smooth over any inconvenient fact standing between her and forgiveness. You have to understand, we thought we were helping your sister build a life. We never meant for any of this to touch you. You sold my life on your front lawn for $15 apiece, Mother, I said. It touched me a long time before Sheldon ever forged a signature. Leland finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse in conversations that required honesty. I co-signed that construction line without reading it, he said. I've spent 40 years surveying other people's land, making sure every boundary line was exact to the inch, and I couldn't be bothered to read 4 pages before I put my name on them. That's on me, Lydia. Not you, not the army. Me. It was the most honest sentence I had ever heard my father say, and it came 3 days too late to change anything material. But it landed somewhere in me anyway, in the part that still remembered him teaching me to read a topographic map at 9 years old. Patient in a way he'd never managed to be about anything involving his own family. I'm not fixing this for either of you, I said. I already fixed what was mine to fix. What Sheldon did to the construction line, to the bank, to whatever else he touched, that's not mine to carry. And I'm done carrying things that were never handed to me honestly in the first place. Agatha's composure finally cracked, and she reached for my hands the way she used to reach for Tabitha's across the breakfast table. A gesture 20 years too late to feel like anything but grief. Please, Lydia, use your influence. Talk to the general, tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him. There's no misunderstanding to explain away, I said, gently, because some part of me still didn't want to watch her break completely on the kitchen linoleum. There's a forged signature, a suspended notary, and a company that was already bankrupt before it ever touched my land. The truth doesn't need my influence, Mother. It just needed someone to finally look at it. My father called me 2 weeks after that kitchen conversation on a Sunday evening, which was unusual enough on its own that I nearly let it go to voicemail out of sheer surprise. He didn't ask me to fix anything this time. He asked, instead, if I'd come by the following Saturday to help him clear a section of storm-damaged fence line along the northern edge of the property, the boundary that happened to run parallel to the forest. I almost said no, out of habit more than anything, but something in the way he'd asked plainly, without an angle attached to it, made me say yes instead. We worked for 4 hours that Saturday without either of us bringing up Sheldon, the loan, or the yard sale even once, resetting cedar bush posts and stringing new wire the way he'd taught me to do as a kid, back when patience was the one thing he'd always had plenty of. Around the 3rd hour, hauling a fence stretcher through the mud, he said, without looking up from the wire. I used to tell people at the surveyor's office that my daughter worked in Army Supply. I never told them what that actually meant, because I never let myself find out. I think some part of me didn't want to know how much bigger your life had gotten than mine, so I just didn't ask. He tightened the wire, tested it with his palm, and added, "I'm sorry it took a federal fraud case for me to say that out loud." I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't. And 20 years of silence doesn't dissolve over one afternoon of fence work. But I told him I appreciated him saying it. And I meant that completely. And when I drove back to base that evening, it was the first time since the yard sale that I felt something in my chest loosen instead of tighten. The federal case against Sheldon Lockhart moved faster than I expected, mostly because the fraud investigators found more once they started looking. 3 other clients besides Misi, whose signatures had passed through the same suspended notary, a second shell company, hiding an even larger unpaid line of credit, and a pattern of forged land certifications stretching back nearly 2 years. He was charged in federal court 6 weeks later with bank fraud, forgery, and identity theft, and the plea agreement his lawyer eventually negotiated included restitution and a 5-year sentence, of which everyone who'd sat in that courtroom annex understood he would serve most. Tabitha wasn't charged. The investigators found no evidence she'd known about the forged power of attorney specifically, only that she'd benefited from a marriage built on money that was never really there. But she filed for divorce within the month, moved back into her old bedroom at the farmhouse, and started answering phones part-time at a title company for $11 an hour, a fact my mother relayed to me over the phone in the flat, deflated voice of a woman still adjusting to a version of reality she hadn't chosen. I spent the better part of that November finishing what I'd started in the well house 2 weeks after the yard sale that had begun all of it. The environmental caveat on the 40 acres converted, once the fraud was confirmed, into a permanent conservation's easement filed jointly with the county and a regional land trust, which meant the forest my grandfather had asked me to protect could never again be used as collateral for anything, by anyone, for as long as the trees stood. I signed the final paperwork on a Thursday afternoon at the same recorder's office where I'd filed the original caveat, and the clerk, an older woman named Doreen, who'd known my grandfather from the county fair committee, told me he would have been proud, and for the first time since the whole ordeal started, I let myself believe that without qualifying it. There was one thread I hadn't closed, and it had been sitting in the back of my mind since the morning of the yard sale, the exact weight of it changing depending on the day. My grandfather's hand-carved chisel set. Hickory handles he'd shaped himself the winter before he died. The one thing from that lawn I hadn't managed to grab back before it disappeared into a stranger's truck had never left my thoughts. Not once. Not through the loan documents or the courthouse or the general's salute. Everything else I'd reclaimed within the hour. That toolbox had simply vanished down the county road, with a man in a Carhartt jacket whose face I've remembered clearly and whose name I didn't know at all. I found him eventually, the way you find most things in a county small enough that everyone's connected by 2 or 3 degrees at most, through Doreen at the recorder's office, who remembered the man from the fairgrounds as Walt Prescott, a retired carpenter from 2 towns over who did small woodworking jobs out of his garage. I drove out on a Saturday in late November, half expecting an argument, and found instead a man mortified to learn what he'd actually bought. Walt's garage smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, workbenches lined with half-finished birdhouses and a rocking chair frame clamped in a vise. He listened to the whole story standing in his doorway with a rag still in his hand, and by the time I finished, his expression had gone from confused to something close to embarrassed on my behalf. $10. He said, shaking his head. First, your sister told me they were estate sale surplus, nothing sentimental. Just a box of old tools somebody didn't want to haul to the dump. I'd never have paid a dime for another man's grandfather's chisels if I'd known what they were. Got my own father's hand plane hanging right there over the bench. He pointed to a wall where an old jointer plane hung on 2 nails, oiled and cared for the way you care for something that matters more than its resale value. I understand exactly what you're asking for, Colonel, and you don't owe me a cent of explanation. He handed the chisel set back to me, already wrapped in the same cloth Sheldon's yard sale had torn it out of, and refused to take a cent for the trouble of returning it. I drove home with the toolbox on the passenger seat, the hickory handles worn smooth in exactly the places my grandfather's hands used to rest. And I understood that the last open thread from that cold October morning had finally closed itself. Tabitha called me once, in early December, from the title company parking lot on her lunch break, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I found the wedding video the other night," she said. "Sheldon's toast. He talked about building an empire together. I used to think that meant something." She was quiet for a second. "I keep thinking about the yard sale. I sold your uniform for $15, Lydia." I didn't even blink. I let the silence sit there rather than filling it for her, because that had always been my job in this family, smoothing over the gaps other people left, and I was done doing it by default. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," I said finally, "but I'm glad you can see it now instead of 3 years from now." "Do you think we can ever get back to normal?" she asked. "I don't think we were ever normal, Tabitha," I said. "I think we were just quiet about it for a really long time. If you want something different going forward, that's going to take longer than a phone call, and it's going to take you actually asking me questions instead of assuming you already know the answers." She didn't have a response for that, not right away, but she didn't hang up either. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like something honest passing between us instead of a performance for whoever happened to be listening. I laid the chisel set on the workbench in the old well house that evening, next to my dress uniform, my boots, and the deployment locker with its bent hasp still unrepaired, because I decided to leave the damage visible rather than fix it, a reminder, not a wound. Everything the yard sale had tried to scatter was back where it belonged, whole, accounted for, exactly the way I'd been trained for 20 years to bring things home. My mother didn't come to say goodbye to me before I left in January, not directly. She left a card on the kitchen counter instead, the farmhouse address printed on the return label like she'd bought it in bulk years ago and never had the occasion to use one. And inside, in handwriting shakier than I remembered, she'd written only a single line. "I don't know how to be the mother of the woman you turned out to be, but I am learning that I should have tried." I read it twice, folded it, and put it in the same folder where I'd kept the loan documents. Not because the two things belonged together, but because I wasn't ready yet to decide whether it deserved a place anywhere else. Some doors you leave open a crack rather than slamming shut, not because you owe anyone forgiveness on a schedule, but because closing them completely takes more energy than you have left to spend. And some questions are better answered slowly, over years, than all at once in a farmhouse kitchen. My transfer to the National Security Council Liaison Office started the first week of January, and I drove out of Ashwood County on a Tuesday morning under a sky the color of wet slate, the same kind of cold, damp weather that had been hanging over the farmhouse the day I'd first pulled into that driveway, and found my life laid out on folding tables for $15 apiece. I stopped at the edge of the property line before I got on the highway, at the spot where the gravel driveway met the tree line, and I looked back at the forest one more time, 40 acres of oak and hickory, untouchable now, standing exactly the way my grandfather had left them to me. I told you at the start I'd let you know which choice I made that morning on the lawn: chase the truck down and make a scene, or stand still and build the case instead. I chose B, the same way I chose it in that courtroom, on that porch, and in every silence in between. It wasn't the easier option. It was just the one that actually won. I thought about the 20 years my family had spent, asking me nothing, assuming everything, and calling on me only when a debt needed covering or a signature needed collecting. I thought about the version of myself who might have kept absorbing that silence for another 20 years, if a padlock hadn't been forced open on a wet October lawn. And I understood, finally, standing at the edge of the road with the engine running behind me, that my family had spent 2 decades asking what my rank could buy them, and not one day asking what it had actually cost me to earn it. And that the difference between those two questions was the entire distance between a family and the people who simply share your last name. My grandfather's note is still folded in the same well house, where I found the loan file that started all of it, tucked now into the lid of his chisel box instead of a filing cabinet drawer. "Keep the trees standing as long as you're breathing, Lydia girl." I used to think he meant only the forest. I understand now he meant all of it. The uniform, the silence I kept for 20 years, the parts of myself nobody in my family ever bothered to ask about. Some things you protect because someone you loved asked you to. And some things you protect because you finally realize nobody else is going to do it for you. And either way, the standing is the point. Dignity, I've come to believe, isn't something you're given. And it isn't something anyone can sell out from under you on a folding table, no matter what price tag they staple to it. It's the thing you keep standing on when everyone around you has decided your silence means you have nothing worth protecting. I paid taxes on a forest for 11 years without asking for a single word of thanks. And I would do it again, because some things you tend not for recognition, but because your grandfather asked you to, and because the tending itself is the only inheritance that can't be forged, mortgaged, or sold for $15 on a Saturday morning. If this story meant something to you, there's another one waiting on your screen right now, one of the most requested stories on this channel, about a family that learned an almost identical lesson the hard way. Go ahead and watch it next. I think you'll be glad you did.